Because I talk about a lot of different topics, I tend to attract a pretty diverse audience. And sometimes members of that audience really like some of my videos, and then they're really shocked to hear me say some things that are not exactly politically correct, or that they may initially perceive as xenophobic or racist or misogynistic or whatever the left-wing buzzwords are. For example, I am a nationalist, and a lot of people have misconceptions about what nationalism actually is. And in the last video and in a few others, I've talked about some of the negative aspects of immigration and of multiculturalism and so-called diversity. And of course, we're constantly sort of barraged with propaganda about, multiculturalism and diversity and how, if you favor having an ethno-state, you must be a horrible person who hates people who are different from you. And for some people that may be true, unfortunately. It's certainly not the case for me. I think one of the key things to understand is that most of my views are universal. For example, I don't just think that massive foreign immigration is bad for Western countries. I think it's bad for any country. And in the same way that I am against foreign people coming to America or European countries and replacing the native people or taking the jobs or whatever the case may be, I'm against that in other countries too. I think every government or every state should be primarily concerned with the best interest of their own people, the people of that country. So for example, in India, I think India should be a place of opportunity for Indians. I would absolutely be against European immigrants going to India and taking advantage of those opportunities. I would like the Indian people to benefit from, the opportunities created for the Indian people in India. So in my last video, I made a comment about Nigerian nurses or Filipino nurses or Pakistani or Indian doctors or IT workers. That doesn't mean that I don't like Nigerians. It doesn't mean that I don't like Filipinos or Pakistani or Indian people. I've had a few Filipino girlfriends. I've had a few Indian girlfriends. My best friend in kindergarten and first grade was an Indian guy. One of my best friends growing up was an Iranian immigrant in a Muslim family that lived down the street from me. My family was good friends with, his family. We would, have dinner at each other's houses and stuff like that. I think that every people pretty much has a culture of their own, and I think that all of those cultures are unique and special in some way. I don't want America to turn into Mexico. That doesn't mean that I have anything against Mexico or Mexican culture. Personally, I really like a lot of things about certain Asian cultures, but I want Europe to remain European, and I want China and Japan and Korea to remain Chinese and Japanese and Korean. I would be against massive waves of Asian immigrants flooding into South America and driving down wages or taking good jobs away from South Americans. So everything that I have to say about nationalism and national sovereignty and the preservation of culture and heritage applies equally to all people and all nations. Something that I often see come up in the comments too is the idea that, borders are imaginary and they don't exist. Well, are the walls of a house or the fence around a family's property also imaginary? Do they exist? Of course not. The walls of a house define the living space of a family. A family needs a living space where they can be a family. And of course, every household is primarily concerned with itself. Parents are going to be more concerned about providing for their own children. That doesn't mean they hate their neighbors' children, but their neighbors are primarily concerned with their own children. One of the problems I see in the world right now is that European people are held to a different standard. So this is kind of a common alt-right talking point, if you want to call it that. But there's the idea that Africa is for the Africans, Asia is for Asians, the Middle East is for Arabs or whatever, but Europe and America are for everybody, right? So when we look at what's going on in the world, these massive waves of immigration seem to be mostly pushed on European countries. We don't really see sub-Saharan Africa being flooded with Europeans. We don't really see Israel being flooded with Syrian refugees. Even other Muslim countries are not being told that they have to take in all of these Muslim refugees. Why is that? It seems to me that there is a concerted effort to destroy the West through mass immigration and race mixing and multiculturalism and so-called diversity. No one is really saying that Japanese companies in Japan need a more diverse board of directors. All of those business opportunities in Japan are for the Japanese people, and it seems totally fine with everyone that those positions are filled with Japanese people. The same is basically true of every other nation. If you look at OPEC or, Saudi Arabia or, some of these oil-rich nations in the Middle East, people aren't really complaining that there aren't enough white people being represented there or enough Asians or blacks or Hispanics or anyone else. It seems totally fine with everyone that the Arab people control and benefit from the resources of their nation or their country. I actually don't have a problem with the people of a country benefiting from the richness and resources of their own country. So why is it a problem if the job opportunities in America are for the American people? I don't think that, Indian doctors are, necessarily any less qualified or less talented than American doctors or anyone else. But doesn't India need good doctors? And if there's a need for more doctors in India, wouldn't it be good for India to lift their own people up to fill those positions so that their own people can enjoy those, higher incomes and those better job opportunities in India? And I'm just saying the same thing for America and European countries. That's all. In America and in Europe, we're also constantly bombarded with talk about discrimination and disadvantaged minority groups, and we're supposed to be very concerned with making sure that blacks and Hispanics or, whoever else have equal opportunities, that they're not discriminated against, and so on. But name even one country that is majority non-white where there is a similar concern that white minorities living in those countries have equal opportunities or aren't discriminated against or have equal representation in government and so on. We don't see it. So again, there seems to be a double standard. Why is it progress for America, a white country, to have its first black president? Would it also be progress if China had its first, white president, or if Israel had its first Arab Muslim prime minister, or if Mexico had its first Asian president, or whatever? When I put it in those terms, it seems absolutely absurd. Going back to the question of, so-called xenophobia, here's a really simple question to ask. Go back in time to when America was mostly populated by the, so-called Native Americans. Was it good for them when massive waves of European migrants came and settled in the Americas? And would it be, quote unquote, xenophobic for a Native American chief to oppose that massive migration of foreign people? So if you think multiculturalism and diversity are such great things, the Native Americans must be absolutely thrilled. Because, we diversified the hell out of them. Obviously, I love my own people. If you're black, Asian, Hispanic, Arab, or whatever else, I think it's only natural and good that you love your own people. If you come from a different culture than I do, then of course, your people have your own unique and beautiful culture, heritage, religious traditions, and way of life. And I think it's perfectly natural and good that you would want to preserve that. And I fully support you in that. And I'm never going to call you a racist or a xenophobe simply for seeking to do so, and simply for seeking to pass on to your children and the next generation what your parents and the previous generation passed on to you as your inheritance. Usually terms like xenophobe, racist, and whatever the other terms are used as a way of dismissing arguments and ideas rather than actually considering them, weighing them on their merits. And if you disagree with anything I say, you're welcome to present counter arguments. I usually welcome that, I appreciate it when it's done in a respectful way, because I usually don't go around disrespecting other people. But that's really all I had to say about that. I just wanted to kind of respond to this basket of deplorables kind of deflection. And I think it's necessary to repeatedly highlight some of these double standards and to ask why these double standards exist. Why is there so much hostility toward white people who want to have white countries, or white people who want to preserve their white heritage or their white culture and so on, when no other group is met with this kind of hostility for seeking to do the same thing. And I already know that some people are going to say, oh, well, what's white culture, or what's white heritage or whatever. Well, you probably wouldn't say that if I were talking about Asian culture or Asian heritage. I mean, obviously, Asian is a broad category, just like white or European is. But only the concept of white or European identity is challenged. The idea of Asian identity is not really challenged, even though if you want to be technical, Korean culture is different from Japanese culture or Chinese culture or Tibetan culture or Mongolian culture or Thai culture or whatever else. And of course, different Arab or Muslim countries, there's a lot of different ethnic groups within that larger racial category. So of course there's tremendous diversity within the white European racial group as well. But the fact that you have different Germanic or Celtic or Scottish or British cultures is not an argument against there being kind of a shared white European identity. Just like there's kind of a shared common Asian identity. Even though the category heading Asian actually contains a lot of different, very different sub-racial or ethnic groups. Each of those has a right to exist. Each of those has a right to preserve its own unique individual culture. I think it's perfectly reasonable for Koreans to limit Japanese immigration because Japan does have a different culture from Korea. They have a different language, they have different traditions, they have different values, they have a different heritage, they have a different identity as a people. And I'm all in favor of Korea remaining Korean. And in the same way, I think that certain European cultures are more compatible than others. So I'm not necessarily promoting some kind of pan-Europeanism any more than I'm promoting some kind of pan-Asianism or whatever. I think it's perfectly legitimate for Ireland to want to preserve Irish identity, for Germany to want to preserve German identity, for Afghanistan to preserve Afghani identity. I might be saying that wrong. If so, I apologize. But basically, I just wanted to emphasize that, yeah, I do talk about race. I do consider race to be important. And I consider national borders, national identity, ethnic identity, and things like this to be important. And I think especially massive immigration from different cultures, different ethnic groups, different races is a threat to social cohesion. It creates racial tension and division, and is generally bad. For example, in Japan, where pretty much everyone's Japanese, they all have the same, culture, heritage, language, cultural values, and so on. There's no such thing as the Black Lives Matter movement. There's not a big problem with people feeling like they're being discriminated against in the workplace or in colleges based on their, race or, ethnicity. Once you start having a lot of different ethnic groups and races and so on sharing the same living space, conflicts arise, tensions arise. Then a black minority, for example, might feel, perhaps justly, perhaps unjustly, that they are being treated unfairly by the justice system or by a police force that is, of course, going to tend to be mostly white because it's a white country. They might feel like they don't have equal representation in government and so on. And Obviously, again, you avoid all of those problems if you have a more ethnically, racially homogenous country. And so I promote ethno-nationalism. I promote racial separation. I think that's best for everybody. It's not because I hate members of other groups, it's because I care about them. Because I care about Indians, I want them to have their own homeland. I want them to have a place called India that is for Indian people and that creates opportunities for Indian people to prosper and be successful and to have good lives and to preserve their unique culture, heritage, and identity as a people. And of course, what I want and respect for all other people, I also want for my own people, right? I mean, the fact that, let's say I have a family and we have a house, there's nothing about that that implies hostility toward my neighbor. I want him to have a house. I want his family to do well. But I want my family to have a house too. I want his family to have a house. I want to try to provide the best life I can for my children. I want to love my wife and treat her well. And I want the same for my neighbor. And if I respect his house and he respects mine, we're going to be good neighbors. But imagine if I'm forced to treat his family as though they have just as much right to my home as my own family does, and yet that's not reciprocated, right? So his house is for him, and my other neighbors' houses are all for them, but my house is unique. In the whole neighborhood, my house is unique in the sense that it belongs to everyone. Well, now my family is effectively homeless, right? So I want every family to have a home. So that's kind of a microcosmic way of putting it. I believe in sovereign nations. I believe in a homeland for all people. And the fact that I don't want my people to lose their homeland or to have their heritage and identity as a people and their culture destroyed through mass migration and, forced assimilation and multiculturalism and diversity, definitely doesn't mean that I'm against anyone else. Again, it's kind of sad to me that I think there are definitely people in the alt-right that do hold attitudes that you could legitimately call, racist and xenophobic and so on. But I guess I kind of advocate a form of enlightened xenophobia or enlightened racism, if your brain can wrap around that concept. If you understand what I'm saying and you don't just stereotype me, because some of the things I say sound kind of like things that other people say, or because it kind of challenges or conflicts with the propaganda that you've been fed all of your life, I think you'll see that my views are actually extremely compassionate, extremely respectful and tolerant of other cultures, other races, other ethnicities, and so on. But I simply want for my own people and my own country what I want for every other people and for every other country. And I don't think there's anything at all in that to be ashamed of or to apologize for. So I don't apologize for it. Now, there's one particular group that I've maybe talked about a little bit more than others. And that's because it's unique in certain ways. I won't name the group because YouTube really doesn't like you talking about this group by name in anything other than glowing terms of praise and adoration. If you say that, they're God's special people, or that, we have to support their ethno-state, that's fine. But if you point out some of the hypocrisies and double standards and some of the negative influences that this particular group is disproportionately having on Western society, that is absolutely not to be tolerated. But I'm going to talk about it because it's very relevant to this discussion, and I think it'll really kind of drive home some of the points I'm trying to make. Let's say that there is a minority population within a country that represents maybe about 2% or so of the population. And let's say this 2% or so minority group has a very strong in-group preference. And let's say that their entire religion is based on the idea that they are chosen and, basically God likes them more than everyone else, right? Everyone else is worth less. They're kind of the master race. This would be the equivalent of having like actual white supremacists in, I don't know, China or something. Let me talk about it in that context, because I think that'll keep me out of hot water, and maybe it'll help prevent this video from getting restricted. Hypothetically, let's say that China had a 2% population of white supremacists, and let's suppose that once you started looking into who owns the major media companies, the major news outlets, the major movie studios, the major record companies, the central banks, some of the major financial institutions, and so on. Let's suppose you found out that virtually all of these major positions were occupied by this 2% minority of white supremacists living in China. And then let's suppose you also looked at, well, let's just assume that China had a similar form of government to the US, where we have kind of 3 branches of government, and they have a Supreme Court where there's 9 people sitting on it. And let's say that 1/3 of their Chinese Supreme Court was filled by this 2% of white supremacist Nazis. All right, so they're 2% of the population, and yet they represent, a third, 33%, 3 out of 9 of the Supreme Court justices in China. Add all of that together. Now, what would you expect? Would you expect that this 2% group of white supremacists who held this vastly disproportionate control and influence in virtually all of the major institutions in China, from government, their Supreme Court, maybe they are the biggest lobby group, spending the most money, they control basically the finances and economics of the country, they control the mass media and basically the propaganda that's being put out, like I said, the record labels, the movie industry, the news, the newspapers, and the publishing companies, and so on. Would you think that these white supremacists are acting in the best interest of China and the Chinese people? Or would you think that they are probably working to subvert the country? Well, of course, you can judge a tree by its fruit. So, if they really were doing what's best for China, then maybe you would say, well, I don't know, this seems kind of wrong somehow, but I guess there's no harm being done. But imagine if they were constantly spreading anti-Chinese propaganda and, spreading all this stuff about how bad the Chinese people were, and spreading all kinds of perversion and degeneracy in the popular media, and they're undermining traditional Chinese values that have held this society together for thousands of years and so on. What would you think about this 2% minority group of white supremacists. So let's say hypothetically, in America and other European countries, there was a similar situation going on, where there's a 2% minority group that are essentially racial supremacist. Their whole religion is basically based on the idea that they are chosen or special, basically better than everyone else, and that they have a right to rule over everyone else. And imagine if they controlled basically all of the major news outlets, Hollywood, the major financial institutions, including the central bank. Let's say they were 3 out of 9 of the Supreme Court justices. Let's suppose that they were some of the biggest campaign donors. Their money has disproportionate influence in U.S. politics. Maybe their country has some of the major, is one of the biggest lobby groups in Congress. Imagine if their interest kind of guided and directed most of our foreign policies related to national defense and war, and we were basically getting in a bunch of wars in countries where we really have no national interest for the sake of their country, which they're primarily loyal to. Would you see any of that as a problem? If you say no, I'm not sure what else to say to you. But I'm saying that there is a particular group that does have exactly this disproportionate power and influence. And to me, it's absolutely absurd to think that they're using that vastly disproportionate power and influence in order to push an agenda that's best for America, as opposed to what's best for their own in-group. And that is the question that is kind of the foremost problem as I see it. But even when I say this, this doesn't mean that I hate those people. Again, what I want from my people, I basically want for them. I basically support the idea of them having a homeland and being able to preserve their own identity as a people, their own culture, their own heritage, and so on. I just don't want my people to be enslaved, and I don't want any other people to be enslaved. I want all the people of the world to be free. I would love to see every nation on earth be free and have a more free society where they have right to free speech, freedom of religion, and so on. And I think they all have a right to create their own immigration policies, and that their immigration policies should reflect the best interest of their people. And that's it. So if anyone is still having trouble understanding my position, I don't really know how else to clarify it. I think you just have some type of cognitive bias where you're so brainwashed that you're not able to see what I'm actually saying. And you have preconceived notions that you're not able to break through and just evaluate what I'm saying on its own terms. I think everything I've just said is perfectly rational and moral and universal. You can't really find any double standards in it. I'm not trying to grant my own people or my own race or my own country any special rights that I'm not also granting to other people. The version of nationalism and ethno-nationalism that I advocate is universal, and it respects and honors all people of every race, every faith, every nationality, the same. It honors the true diversity of the world in the sense that I want to preserve that diversity. If you mix it all together, the diversity is lost. And one of the things that holds a society together is the fact that they have a common identity. They have a shared culture. They have a shared set of cultural values. They have a common history, a common ancestry, a common heritage, a common purpose, and a common destiny as a people or as a nation. If you take that away from them, they're just a bunch of atomized individuals. Social trust is corroded, and they really cease to be a nation. They cease to be a community. And then it's just individual against individual. That's not the world I want to live in. Who do you think is better off? An orphan that's raised in an orphanage, or a kid that grows up in a loving family? I think you're off your rocker if you think that the orphan raised in an orphanage is better off. And in exactly the same way, I think it's much better to be a member of a community, of a nation, of a group of people that have a common identity, a common history, heritage, a shared culture, a shared set of values, ideally a common religion, definitely a common language, because no one looks at the story of the Tower of Babel in the Old Testament and says, oh wow, that's great, they speak so many different languages, look how well that all works out for them. So again, I just wanted to clarify some of my positions on these topics because it's something that comes up quite a bit. Because again, people listen to a lot of what I have to say about certain topics and they're like, wow, he's a really deep guy. He seems to be, an intelligent guy with some really great thoughts on a lot of things, seems really, moral and rational, but racist, misogynist, xenophobic, and just none of that is true. It's just that you've been brainwashed with a lot of bad ideas for your whole life, and I'm telling you the truth now. And I think the more that you think about my ideas and the arguments I present, the more you'll see that this is the truly rational and moral position that is truly universal. Because like I said, multiculturalism and this whole cult is not universal. They apply a different set of standards to white people and Europeans than to everyone else. I'm advocating true equality. I'm advocating true multiculturalism and diversity. I'm representing true internationalism. You can't have internationalism without separate sovereign nations. That's what the word international means. It has to do with relationships between nations. And I absolutely advocate peaceful, harmonious coexistence between nations. I love the idea of nations coming together for mutual aid and working together and having mutually beneficial relationships, in terms of trade, economics, and so on. This is like saying that you can't have interpersonal relationships without persons. That's what an interpersonal relationship is. It's a relationship between two or more persons. If you try to abolish the whole idea of individuality, you've done away with interpersonal relationships. So you can be an internationalist, but not be a globalist. And that's basically how I would describe myself. I'm a true internationalist, and I'm absolutely an anti-globalist. So I'm going to end there for now. I've said quite a bit. I'm probably likely to get some interesting comments on this video. But I'm happy to respond to them, and I'm happy to have these discussions because I really do think it's one of the most important issues of our time in terms of socio-political issues. So thanks for listening. I hope that clarified my position on some of these things. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend, and peace.